Excellent. Good afternoon or good morning, as whatever time it may be. It is a real pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you today about what we've learned about copy number variation at 1q21.1 from a behavioral perspective. What we want to chat about here in our short time today is kind of our clinical findings, what we've learned from the Simons VIP study regarding 1q21.1. So in our short time today, what I'll do is I'll first talk a little bit about clinical or behavioral phenotyping, kind of what that is. I'll talk specifically about what our approach at the Simons VIP has been to understand and quantify the clinical phenotype. And then specifically I'm going to talk more about neurodevelopmental disorders that we were focusing on with our study, as well as information about cognitive abilities and some other abilities that we've learned about through Simons VIP, focusing on 1q21.1. And I hope to sort of pull that all together with some key takeaway points at the end of our time today. So to start, what are we talking about when we talk about clinical phenotyping in Simons VIP? Well, first of all, phenotyping simply is referring to kind of the documentation of those observable characteristics or traits of an organism. That is, phenotyping refers to the documentation of the phenotype. The phenotype is in counterpart to the genotype. That is the genetic contribution. So we're talking about those observable characteristics for any organism, but in this case, we're talking about people. And clinical phenotyping is focusing on those observable traits or characteristics that are tied to clinical characteristics. That is, diagnoses, neurocognitive functioning, traits that are related to how someone fares kind of day to day, and the clinical considerations are related to that. So it sounds kind of easy when we say, well, clinical phenotyping, we're just focusing on those observable traits related to clinical characteristics. But this actually can be very complicated. And so the example I would use to start would just be in thinking about anytime we try to capture or quantify behavior, we have to think about a lot of different factors for that. For example, we have to think about how old a certain person is might impact what sort of clinical characteristics might be shown. So, for example, individual who is struggling from depression, that might look very different in a 25-year-old person compared to a 6-year-old person, or an 8-year-old person, or a 14-year-old person. These are all going to look a little different. One example is that where an adult might sort of seem sad and down, oftentimes we don't necessarily see that in kids, and instead we see more marked irritability, which could come out as challenging behaviors or aggression, things like that. So the age with which a certain person is, it makes it difficult, and we have to consider that when thinking about clinical characteristics. We also have to think about day-to-day things. Behavior is impacted by how tired we are. It's impacted if, say, for example, we just got off the plane from Virginia and we've landed in Seattle to participate in a research study. And, well, our behavior might be a little bit different when we're in a new state, a new city, a new weird sort of testing situation with novel people. That's going to look very different from what things look like in the home. And so you have to think about consider all these different factors: the age, how a person's feeling, what's been going on, what is the context. To think about all these things when making our judgments about these clinical characteristics. So we try to address and control for these by doing a lot of different things. The first thing we did was we made sure we had multiple day visits. So here, kind of on this slide, I'm just sort of refreshing our mind about what that looked like in the Simons VIP study. Families were originally contacted and recruited through the Emery and Geisinger team, where there was that screening that was done and a review of medical records and a review of medical history. And then at our assessment sites, either at Children's Hospital in Boston, at Texas Children's in Houston, or at University of Washington in Seattle, we then conducted are studying a way to try to control for all of those complications when thinking of behavior. So we had multiple day visits. So we made sure we saw folks over the period of a couple days. We want to have sort of multiple opportunities to see a given individual. It's kind of difficult to determine everything based on a simple short visit. We want to make sure we see both kids and adults kind of at multiple time points to really get to know someone. We really wanted to collect information from all family members, and we collected information um, not only about all family members, but we collected information about given individuals from many different family members. So that is, we didn't want to rely just only on our observation, but we wanted to make sure that we were pulling information from moms and dads who are really the experts in their children, of course, and so we want to make sure we're gathering that information. So we had information from multiple sources, from the participant, him or herself, as well as from family members, and we had multiple clinicians that were working with each family, so we could kind of triangulate our information, and that was all done under the supervision of an experienced, licensed clinical psychologist, so that we made sure that we were having clinicians who were expert in the diagnosis and characterization of neurodevelopmental disorders and understanding of the diagnoses that we're focusing on. Someone could kind of oversee that complicated process. As you recall from those who participated in the project, we also conducted some standardized testing, neurocognitive testing. We also did structural MRI for those folks for whom that worked. And we made sure we wanted to provide a little bit of clinical feedback at that opportunity to really to try to give back at least in some way, given how much time and energy those of you that participated in that you provided to us to sort of move this science forward. And then just as a reminder, some folks also participated in a second level of imaging using MRI and MEG, as well as some additional neurocognitive measures, either at UCSF or CHOP. So we collected a lot of information. We collected a lot of information from a lot of different tools to help aid in sort of making sense of that complex clinical diagnosis. And we also gathered information from a variety of different domains. Again, all of these different domains help inform sort of the diagnostic presentation. So I won't go over all of the different measures we used here on this slide, but what we've done here is broken them down into different domains so that many of the measures that we collected information so we could help inform diagnosis. So we wanted to gather information about adaptive behaviors. Those are kind of like those everyday skills. How do we do when we're getting dressed and getting ready in the morning? How does our can we tell time? How do we do with making our way around in the community? So everyday skills. As well, we wanted to gather information about cognitive abilities, motor abilities, language skills, learning achievement, etc. So as part of the Science VAP project, for clinical phenotyping, what we were looking for was really a wide range of disorders, but specifically with a focus on neurodevelopmental disorders. Really want to understand and accurately make those diagnoses around neurodevelopmental disorders as well as psychiatric disorders. These are things like anxiety and depression and such. But what are neurodevelopmental disorders? Well, these are a type of mental disorder that is a disorder that's based in the brain, and they have an onset in the developmental period, kind of thinking really early on in development, before even entering grade school. And as part of the diagnostic criteria, they must produce some measure of impairments or deficits in either personal, social, academic, or occupational functioning. That's actually the diagnostic criteria. Many of us can have challenges that are related to the diagnoses, a neurodevelopmental disorder diagnosis, but it must be to a point or level that causes impairment. So, for example, when thinking about a neurodevelopmental disorder such as autism, with autism we're looking for impairments in both social communication or the presence of atypical behaviors that are like a stereotypic or repetitive restricted interests or behaviors. Many of us have restricted interests and behaviors. For example, me, I just decided I was going to get a PhD and focus on studying neurodevelopmental disorders. That was a pretty specific focused interest for me. But it's it has not caused any clinical level of impairment. Although I suppose we could chat with my wife, and she might say, you work awfully hard, Rafe. So it might sort of produce some impairment in social functioning. I'm sort of being silly here a little bit. The point being is that we can all have traits that are related to neurodevelopmental disorders, but yet not to a level that exceeds or a threshold for producing impairments in various different domains. And neurodevelopmental disorders refer to a wide range of issues. So these could be very specific, thinking about how an individual might fare with learning. So, for example, like a learning disability. Or might be more globally impactful, such that we're impacting overall cognitive abilities or overall social skills. What makes things complicated, even more complicated than things I already talked about before, is that many of these neurodevelopmental disorders can co-occur. And so that, again, adds to the complexity as we start to think about, are the challenges with executive control, such as hyperactivity, impulsivity, are these part and parcel for this individual part of an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, or are these really part of an ADHD diagnosis? Or maybe they're both happening here, and we have to sort of really tease those things apart. So what we focused on with Simon's CIP was looking at intellectual disability, learning disabilities, things like dyslexia. We were focused also on impairments and deficits in motor skills. Specific diagnosis is called developmental coordination disorder. We also are interested in a variety of communication disorders, things like receptive or expressive language challenges or speech sound disorders that disrupt articulation. We're also focused on autism spectrum disorders, as well as ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, as well as other disruptive behavior disorders, things like oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder. And we're also looking for tic disorders. What we found with Simon's CIP study was, I guess it's kind of eye-opening in that we saw a range of different challenges that we found. What we first did was we really wanted to just look at the number of individuals who met specific criteria for a given diagnosis, all these different diagnoses are just highlighted out. So that means that they had to be having enough difficulty in a specific area that it was associated with some sort of significant distress or disability in those 4 different domains we talked about, again, personal, social, occupational, educational. There were other individuals that had some of those symptoms but didn't necessarily meet criteria for the diagnosis. And that becomes important as we think about kind of how 1q21 is affecting behavior. But we have to start somewhere. So we want to start first with just who met sufficient threshold for these challenges to meet diagnostic criteria. So if we start first with our deletion carriers, what we have in this on this slide here is the different diagnostic categories, these different neurodevelopmental disorders along the x-axis, and the y-axis is you have a percentage, which is can be misleading when we look at percentages here because we're only talking about a total of 19 individuals that we're able to study here in this first preliminary analysis of individuals with 1q21.1 deletion. So in thinking about these are still small numbers. But what we find is that there's kind of a range of challenges with the most common, I'm using air quotes that you can't see right now with the phone, but I'm using air quotes here, and the most common challenges with had to do with mood disorders, anxiety or depression. But really we saw kind of a whole range of different challenges for our individuals with deletions. There was no one particular diagnosis that seemed to emerge as, wow, we see this really strongly linked. We saw sort of range of challenges. With our duplication carriers here shown on this next slide, we start to see a little bit more of a pattern emerging with our most common diagnosis, again, I'm using air quotes again here, being a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, followed by ADHD and intellectual disability. And that then is subsequently followed by developmental coordination disorder, and then lastly, sort of anxiety and mood disorders still being seen. So, again, in terms of our diagnostic profile, there's no clear diagnostic profile for either our individual deletion or the duplication. We're seeing a range of challenges that are impacting neurodevelopment broadly, such that many individuals are meeting criteria for distinct disorders, but again, there's a whole range there. So I'm gonna pause for a second. I'm gonna move away from our diagnostic profile to more focus in on our assessment of cognitive ability. So when we're talking about cognitive ability or general intelligence, we're talking about that ability to think about ideas, analyze a given situation, solve problems, and we measure that through various types of intelligence tests that are all standardized, and then separate skill and performance into kind of two different domains, usually verbal abilities and nonverbal abilities. We assess verbal abilities by asking folks to define words or identify similarities between types of words. We also, on the nonverbal side of things, are asking folks to sort of put puzzles together to match a picture or identify similarities between pictures or identify missing parts of a picture, things like that. And here's what we found. This is sort of a complicated slide here. What we have on the y-axis is our IQ score, and the way IQ is measured, an individual with average intelligence has an IQ of 100, and the standard deviation is about is 15. So that means most folks are going to fall. Kind of the normal range is defined as an IQ between 85 and 115. That is a standard deviation above and below that mean. So that's kind of where most folks are falling through. Some falling somewhere between 85 and 115. Then we have on the x-axis we have individual with full scale IQ on the left. Measure the full scale IQ on the left, which means kind of both verbal and nonverbal IQ combined. In the middle sort of section, we have focus on just on the verbal IQ, and on the right-hand side, we're focusing on nonverbal IQ. In red, we have our folks at deletion, and blue, our duplication, as well as we have other family members who participate in the study who do not have either deletion or duplication. This is kind of our comparison group. And that is kind of like is that a tan color, peach color? I'm not sure what color it is. But at any rate, that third group, that non-carrier group, we see an IQ solidly in the average range, exactly what we'd expect for sort of a typical comparison group. Our individual deletions also have IQ that falls solidly in the average range, but there's a little more variability, and you can see that variability by those little error bars that extend above and beyond the tip of the bar there. So there's a good amount of variability in our individual deletions, but on average, we're seeing abilities falling solidly in the average range. Our duplication carriers are falling solidly in that low average range, and again with considerable variability, ranging from folks who have intellectual disability, that is a diagnosis of significant impairment in cognitive ability, to folks that are above average. So a lot of variability here in terms of the cognitive profile. So as I mentioned, abilities are falling in the average range for our folks with deletions, in the low average range for folks with duplications, but substantial variability across both. Now, when we look at similar abilities, those adaptive abilities, we see similar sort of challenges. So with our daily living skills, again, these are things like taking care of yourself, getting dressed, toileting, using money, telling time, those sorts of things. We're seeing a similar pattern of average abilities for deletion and low average for our duplication carriers. And as we mentioned earlier, when we were talking about that diagnostic profile, sometimes we saw some learning disabilities like reading and math challenges. And most often we saw those associated with folks who are also showing some cognitive challenges. So our next slide here kind of shows a variety of different domains of functioning. And we've already chatted about nonverbal and verbal IQ, those cognitive abilities. Those are the groups in the first green circle that we look at here. So let me just talk about this figure for a second. On the y-axis, we have kind of the average score on a given measure, and on the x-axis, we have different domains of function that we were looking at. So in the first two columns there, we've got nonverbal IQ and verbal IQ. We've got, again, individuals with deletion are in red, individuals with duplication are in blue, and then our comparison cohort of typical family members are in that sort of peach tannish color. So as we discussed, our cognitive abilities are falling in the average for deletion and low average for duplication cases. We see a similar pattern with our adaptive skills. That's adaptability. That's the third sort of column, or that second little green circle. We also looked at motor skills, and we assessed motor skills with kind of an annoying task. It's called the Purdue Pegboard task, and what we do is we ask folks to take these tiny little silver pins, and with one hand go ahead and take these pins out of a little bin and place them on this pegboard as quickly as they can. Then we do this with another hand, and then we do this with both hands, and we can compare that against large numbers of population folks to see how folks broadly do that. We can determine, well, is someone showing challenges in this? Are they doing well or more impaired? And what we find is for our deletion carriers, we see sort of this low average performance, but we see a real challenge emerge for our duplication carriers, where we're seeing impairment that's falling well below what is expected for our individual duplication. So motor ability seems to be significantly impacted for our duplication carriers. When we look to our another domain we looked at was phonological processing. So now we're looking at the fourth green circle from the left on your slide. And what phonological processing is, that's the ability to process phonemes, those are the most meaningful units of sound. And we do this with an annoying task called the non-word repetition task. I know, we do all these annoying tasks. And this non-word repetition task, what we do is we simply present folks with these made-up, invented words, and we ask folks to repeat them back. And we just simply track how many words folks are able to accurately reproduce. And so we see for both our deletion and duplication carriers, and these are children only now, where we're not able to do this task with adults. We don't have proper norms for adults, so this is only with kiddos. We saw a pretty big spread, a lot of variability. Largely that has to do with because we're talking about smaller numbers here. But we see some challenges in phonological processing. This is a difficult task for both individuals with deletion and duplication. Now, the other domain we looked at was autism severity. So this is now the final green circle here, the far right column. And just to orient you to autism severity, the way this score is sort of calibrated is kind of reverse what we've been talking about. So higher a score on this value means the greater the autism severity, the greater the challenge. And such that with scores under 30, essentially would mean that a child does not meet diagnostic criteria for autism, and whereas scores between 40 and 100 on the scale would indicate challenges that are associated with an autism diagnosis. So as we'd expect, our comparison group is falling solidly where we'd expect them to be without any ASD-related challenges. Our deletion cases, we see a slight elevation in terms of autism severity. And for our duplication carriers, we see a much higher rate of ASD or autism symptomatology. And now this is a rating of autism severity that's based on a standardized measure we use, and it's based on clinical observation. So we're looking for the challenges, how significant are the challenges in social communication, and or how present and challenging are the restricted or repetitive behaviors associated with autism. And so for even folks that aren't meeting diagnostic criteria in our duplication cohort, we're still seeing ASD-related challenges even if they're not meeting ASD diagnostic criteria. Again, so it speaks to, starts to hint at a stronger relationship for our duplication carriers with autism than our deletion carriers. So if we were to just sort of kind of have a summary comparison side by side between our deletion carriers and our duplication carriers, we've already chatted about much of this, but what we see in terms of our diagnostic categories, we see there's a great deal of variability for both deletion and duplication in the types of diagnoses that are made, but we're seeing a higher rate of diagnoses being made in our sample of folks with the duplication. Only about half of our carriers of the deletion actually met diagnostic criteria at all. About 53% had at least one diagnosis. So that really means about half of our carriers aren't showing any challenges that meet diagnostic threshold. Our duplication carriers, about 68%, are meeting that sort of diagnostic threshold. In terms of autism specifically, only 10% of our deletion carriers meet diagnostic criteria for ASD, whereas 40% of our duplication carriers do. We already chatted about kind of the most frequent diagnoses that emerge: anxiety and mood disorders for our deletions, along with developmental coordination disorder. Again, that's a disorder associated with motor challenges. Those are the most common. Where our duplication carriers, it's autism, ADHD, and intellectual disability are the most common. And again, we're talking about small sample sizes here, so it's hard to really draw too many conclusions in terms of the common diagnoses, but just want to highlight those are the emerging diagnoses. We already chatted about IQ ability. We chatted about motor skills with a real pronounced challenge for our duplication cases. And we chatted about that ASD-related severity as well already. So that's kind of the emerging picture for individuals with 1q21 deletion duplication. But I want to pause for one moment and just highlight that given many of the challenges that we're seeing in terms of neurodevelopmental disorders, challenges with language impairments, cognitive deficits, we know there's increased rates or likelihood to see behavioral challenges. And behavioral challenges, meaning tantrums, struggles with sort of that quick aggression or frustration and really characterized by sort of oppositional tantruming, those sorts of things. We know we're going to see increased behavioral challenges along with many of the things that we see for folks with 1q21 deletion or duplication. And these behavioral challenges, a lengthy tantrum in a supermarket or a tantrum on the bus, these are very challenging, and they can really impact your quality of life. And so I just want to make a quick shout out that there are ways to address challenging behaviors, and oftentimes by reducing or addressing challenging behaviors early on, we can really improve quality of life and help promote the learning that kids need to have by being in their community, in with their fellow students and such. That's where that learning is going to happen, so we can address the underlying neurodevelopmental challenges. And so we got to get rid of those. We got to try to reduce those challenging behaviors first. Oftentimes by improving language ability and communication skills, reducing anxiety, in improving and clarifying expectations. These are sort of key things to reduce challenging behaviors. There's a number of different resources that are available. I know at our Simon's VIP family meeting, we had specific talk about challenging behaviors, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but just want to highlight that there are a couple different resources. The first is seeking out your local experts. These would be either psychologists with expertise in neurodevelopmental disorders or folks who are expert with behavioral therapies. This might be a board-certified behavior analyst, someone who uses applied behavioral analysis to reduce or address the challenging behaviors. Those are going to be great resources in the community for you. What they can do is they can come on in, meet with you, meet with your child, really to identify what's going on, what's happening with this behavior. First, they're going to really understand the behavior, and then they want to really do a functional analysis to understand, well, what happens before the behavior? What happens after the behavior? What is driving this behavior? By identifying that clearly and really understanding what the antecedents, what the consequences, what that behavior is itself, then you can intervene at either of those points, either beforehand by changing the situation or avoiding particular situations, or intervening with consequence. Maybe there's something that we're doing as parents that somehow is supporting or reinforcing that behavior and continuing it to happen, continuing to make it happen or support it to happening, so that we can change our behavior to modify. There's also a couple great books that a lot of parents have expressed sort of interest that they really liked and that I think are pretty good. The Explosive Child, Your Defiant Child, Your Defiant Teener, a couple of those good books. There's many other out there. Those are just a couple that I know families have been really happy with. So what are our quick take-home points? Well, from this preliminary study of individuals with 1q21 deletion duplication, what we see is we see a higher risk for a wide range of developmental issues, all the range of neurodevelopmental disorders we talked about. So what that means is that early assessment is essential, because when we intervene early, we can improve outcomes. Unfortunately, this also means is that, as many of you know, parents have to be advocates for services. Right now, you're paving the way. You're paving the way for individuals with 1q21.1, and so you have to really be a strong advocate for your child to make sure that you're getting the services you need. Hopefully the healthcare and education system will be able to catch up to us, but they're not there yet. The other sort of take-home point is it seems that individuals with duplication seem to have greater ASD-related impairments, intellectual deficits, and these fine motor functioning challenges. And we're starting to see that pattern emerge. It's still early, but we're trying to make sense of that. But clearly that issues and interventions can change as children age. And so what we recommend in terms of behavior is we recommend that you're staying in touch with your provider, your primary care provider, to see when reassessment is essential. It's going to be vital when you see behavior changes, when you have new things that seem to emerge. It probably makes sense to get that reassessment at that point. So those are kind of the key take-home points based on our initial study here. But the one thing I want to really close with is just say thank you to you for participating in this work. We couldn't do any of this work. We couldn't even start to make sense of 1q21 deletion duplication without your time, your energy, in some cases your blood, and that your commitment to moving the science forward. So thank you so much for listening today. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.